Okay, today we're going to talk about converging flashpoints, and it's a little early. I haven't had much sleep for a few days. I might stumble over my words more than usual. I don't think that when I've done these updates, and I've been doing them for quite a while now, even for a decade or so before we started Fellowship Bible Chapel, that I've ever had as many things that I've wanted to talk about, but because we have a special speaker today, I just won't have time to get to. Editing this down as we see literally all of these converging flashpoints happening was a very difficult task this week. So I'll apologize in advance if I stumble around a bit, but there was a lot of things that happened this week if you were paying attention. We talk each week about all of these different events that are going to converge. For example, in the upper center there, we have the Jerusalem will be a cup of trembling. We saw a lot of things about Jerusalem this week. We saw things that would be related to the rebuilding of the temple. We saw things related to the land of Israel and its surrounding enemies, all of which I believe and we believe here are significant events related to the end times. We saw things about artificial intelligence, which is, I think, on a track to become sort of a modern day Tower of Babel. It's interesting, I can sit in my family room in my chair and I can read. I have access through a particular app that I have, Press Display or Press Reader. I have access to about 7,000 newspapers from around the world each day that are come in digital form. I also have access to the text version of those things, and with Google Translate, I can pull off Arabic, Turkish, Farsi articles and translate them into understandable English almost immediately. This is something that nobody was ever able to do in history, in the world before. And so where we started at the Tower of Babel with one language, and then God confused the languages, we're going back in that direction. It's also interesting, I saw a study a number of years ago. I have not been able to find the graphic. I believe it was my nephew said they had discussed this in a class that he took when he was in seminary up in Massachusetts. He took a class down at Boston University. I never asked him if he met that occasional cortex, whatever her name is. But what that graphic that he saw the professor use, and I've seen it, is they trace the center of Christianity. And Christianity, of course, we know started in Jerusalem. And then it moved up to Antioch. It moved across Europe through the Roman Empire. It actually moved out into the Atlantic Ocean at one point with the growth of America and the Western Hemisphere. But at some point back around 1960, 1970, it made a U-turn. And it's on a track to end up back in Jerusalem again. Now, I wish I could find the graphic because I find it to be a very interesting point that's related to Bible prophecy, because Bible prophecy is Jerusalem, Middle East, Israel-centric in many respects. But it also has its global impact. And the people in the world, look, this is an old cover from Foreign Policy magazine, A World Disrupted. And it sure does seem to be a world disrupted. This week in Mozambique, and Malawi and Zimbabwe, in southeastern Africa, they had a massive cyclone. The cyclone hit 3 countries, affected a couple of million people. One city was effectively, they said, 90% destroyed. A number of articles I read said it was either if not the strongest, certainly one of the top catastrophic storms in the history of the Southern Hemisphere, in the history of mankind. it causes, and you can see the pictures there in the aerial photographs of the flooding that occurred. They don't know how bad it will be because a lot of people, for example, our church through Finish Line Ministries helps with a ministry that Finish Line has in Malawi, which is a landlocked country near Zimbabwe and south central Africa, more close to the central part of Africa. And they don't know the damage yet because they store their corn. And they don't know how much of their corn is damaged yet because of the flooding that took place. And if their corn is damaged, they are not going to be able to regrow it in time. This is a potential massive humanitarian disaster. And we see these disasters all the time. I keep reading these stories about fires in California, flooding in California, followed by flooding in California, which was preceded by drought in California. I read an article that in Mammoth, up in just a little bit south of and east of Yosemite, the highest town in California, people have tunnels on their streets. The snow walls are 20 feet high because of all the snow they had in Mammoth this winter. They had storms where they had 8 or 9 feet of snow. And I keep reading these articles, and they keep saying, it's unprecedented. This has never happened before. And this is a storm of, or damage of, what do they say? Biblical proportions. Now, they always tie it to climate change. This is a picture of Nebraska. The worst flooding in Nebraska history. Articles that I read say that many farmers will file. There's a special provision under the United States Code to allow family farmers to file bankruptcy. And there will be hundreds of bankruptcies resulting from the floods this year because people, they're always on sort of the edge. And I do some agricultural banking work, so I've dealt with these issues. And, you know, they live on the edge, and they have a bad year, and they go out of business or they go into bankruptcy. And these floods are things they've never seen. They're towns that are completely isolated in Nebraska. And they don't know that the worst of the flooding is over yet if we get more storms. It's this, and again, what is the term they use? Unprecedented. There are ironic things that we see in our culture. This is a letter from the lady that is behind the movie, or sort of was the inspiration for the movie Unplanned. She was an abortion worker. She saw the light. She's now a pro-life activist, and they've made a movie about her life called Unplanned. I believe now she has 7 children. She's pregnant with her 8th. And she wrote a letter to abortion workers about why they should go see the movie Unplanned. The ironic thing, though, is that the movie rating agency, because they actually show the results of an abortion, gave the movie an R rating. So the headline in one of the Christian news websites was, at 13 she can get abortion, but she can't see the movie Unplanned. She can go to an abortion without her parents' consent, but she can't go see the movie about an abortion. We live in insanity. At some point that we've crossed the line in our culture. Somebody from England sent me this: medical care for gender variant children and young people, answering families' questions. An organization that calls itself Mermaids. And so this is the National Health Service in England, Great Britain, a publication about treating transgender children. They chemically castrate children. And if you talk about it, you run the risk of getting banned or blocked. There was a lady, I mentioned her, she was arrested because she refused to refer to a man who claimed to be a woman as a man. She said he was born a male. She referred to him that way, and she was arrested and taken down to the police station for about 8 hours. Now, I think the charges have been dropped against her, but this is insanity. In Connecticut high schools, some of the track records are now held by men boys who claim to be identifying as women. And even if you speak up about this, they lambaste you. Martina Navratilova has been kicked out of LGBTQ groups. She's a lesbian herself. And she said, you can't have men competing against women. It'll eventually work its way into the NCAAs, and we'll eventually, I think, have two men's tournaments and not a men's basketball and a women's basketball. But that's where we're headed. There are also some touches of irony, though, that I find kind of humorous. This is the new cover. This is a trigger warning for you. This is the new cover of Time magazine. The phenom, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or somebody, a friend of mine mentioned, I won't use his name, he calls her occasional cortex. Go look up cortex if you need to look it up. The ironic thing, though, about this cover is that it's dated April 1st, 2019. So sometimes there's even a convergence of humor. And this is no joke, though, folks. She is very popular. Southern Poverty Law Center, which labels everything a hate group that is on the Christian side. Pro-life groups, Christian groups, they're going through a state of turmoil. Morris Dees, their founder, had to resign this week for Morris Dees' unspecified conduct. The word is that it was sexual misconduct and incidents of, are you ready for it? Racism. So it's always good when you see them eat their own. And the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it's neither poverty nor legal, has resigned also because he wasn't overseeing things. This is an organization that has massed somewhere between $300 and $500 million, mostly kept in offshore banks. It has, during the Obama administration, it partnered with the Obama administration to identify terrorist cells or terrorist-leaning organizations. Guess who they were picking? Some of them are obvious, okay, but there's pro-life groups here in our area that were put on their hate list. In itself is a hate, so SPLC is itself a hate group of epic proportions. So I'm glad to see that they're having some issues. Well, it's finally been released, the Muller Report, but nobody knows what it says. But that doesn't prevent everybody. This is pretty much the entire front cover of the Washington Post, at least half of the front page. On Saturday, the report was released to Attorney General Barr, or delivered to Attorney General Barr on Friday afternoon. So Saturday morning, all the newspapers everywhere were front page headlines about the Mueller report. And of course, everybody was speculating. Chris Matthews had a meltdown. He can't believe that the word is that Mueller is recommending no further indictments. How's he getting away with this? And it's turning out to be, as a lot of people said, a real nothing burger. But the New York Times, this is from the inside of the New York Times yesterday, 8 full pages dealing with a report that nobody's read. And there was half of another page because they said, well, now it's going to go to the Southern District of New York, who's also investigating the Trump administration. We don't know what it'll be. They may release something today. They say they're only going to release it to Congress. But if they release it to Congress, it'll be all over the news. There'll be leaks like crazy. You know how these things work, especially if they can find anything negative. But so we have 8 full pages in the New York Times about nothing. It's like we live Jerry Seinfeld show, the Seinfeld show, they did a thing about they were going to write a show for NBC and they were going to call it a show about nothing. What happens? Nothing happens. So now we live where the New York Times and the Washington Post, MSNBC, and CNN talk about nothing. Because nobody knows, but we spend all day on it. Rachel Maddow was crying the other night on her show. Anyway, New Zealand, the reaction to the terror attack at the mosque a little over a week ago, in which I believe 50 people were killed. They had a observation in New Zealand of the Muslim call to prayer, an interfaith prayer service, and the upper picture there in the center is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and women all over New Zealand were encouraged to wear hijabs. This is highly troublesome. As I said last week, 50 people were sent into a Christless eternity by an evil person. But we really can't talk about the evil of Islam. And I showed you example after example. There were more killings of Christians by Muslims in Nigeria this week. Thousands have been killed. In India, historically, somewhere between 80 and 200 million Indians were killed by Muslim invaders. Do we ever talk about that? Can we talk about the evil of that religion? I'm going to give you some examples this week. Somebody last week, and I can't see because of the lights, but somebody accused me of being soft on Islam. It says Shame John is so soft on Islam because he's afraid of YouTube. Now listen, you cannot have, and by the way, the person used a fake account to tell me that I was being scared. I was a scaredy cat. Note the irony. He used a fake account of Alfred B. Newman as his icon for Mad Magazine. So I don't think he'll, at least under that name, he'll be commenting on our YouTube channel in the future. But I've spoken about Islam plenty. Look, I'm concerned about the people who were killed in the terror attack because their eternal fate has been sealed. And I have no reason to be optimistic about that, but capitulating to that religion as New Zealand has done, thousands joined in prayer. Seth Frantzman in the Jerusalem Post had a great article on Thursday or Friday. Don't mention it. New Zealand's Orwellian approach to terror. And he's right. I received number of emails this week from people who watched these updates in New Zealand who said, there's pressure on us. We're being told if we have that manifesto, we need to delete it off of our hard drives if we have a copy of the video. And they are concerned that if they keep that or publish it or share it with someone, they're going to be arrested. And Seth Frantzman makes a great point. Why don't we talk about the ideology and what drove this guy, what was going on in his head to do this? What we got is everybody capitulating to Islam. This is very concerning. It should be concerning. President Erdogan of Turkey, he gave speeches this week. They're having some local elections in Turkey. He was using the video in his speeches, and you can see here there's a picture of all the names of all the people killed in the New Zealand attack. And he says, from the New Zealand with the messages, they're giving from there. And we, the Turkey nation, have been here for 1,000 years. And we'll be here until the apocalypse, God willing. You will not be able to turn Istanbul to Constantinople. Your grandfathers came here and saw that we were here. And then some turned back on foot, some in caskets. If you come with the same intentions, you are always welcome. Have no doubt we will send you back like your grandfathers. Now listen, Turkey is one of the major players in end times Bible prophecy in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. Erdogan talks about it, but why do we in the West, everybody has to shut up about the conflict, the clash of civilizations that we find ourselves in? Everywhere you look, there's chaos. This is the New Yorker from this week. Big Ben is a cuckoo clock. Actually, he couldn't do that right now because we were there just a few months ago and it's under renovation. So it's got scaffolding all around it. But Brexit, they want to, the whole British government is in chaos about all of these things. Last week I talked to you a little bit about technology, the autocrat's new toolkit. What are they going to use? And the quote from the Wall Street Journal article was this: as dystopian and repressive as these efforts sound, the use of artificial intelligence, just wait. They may soon look like the quaint tactics of yesteryear, a sophisticated new set of technological tools, some of them now maturing, other poised to emerge over the coming decades, seem destined to wind up in the hands of autocrats around the world. And this week, article in the Wall Street Journal, in Western China, the Uyghur culture, which is Islamic, China is essentially trying to either eradicate it, remove it as a separate Islamic culture, because it's a very critical thing in China's One Belt, One Road initiative. There are at least 1 million, if not millions of people in re-education centers, concentration camps. And you can see them. They're called re-education centers. Do you see the picture on the right with the fence with the barbed wire on top in the guard tower? Does that look like a school to you? It's a prison. It's a prison camp. It's a concentration camp. And they're getting people to turn on. Now listen, they have trouble with Islamic terror in Western China. It's a critical part on their One Belt, One Road initiative. Here's a map of what they're trying to do. And you see the town up there. It goes from Jian, Lanzhou to Urumqi, however you say that. And that's a critical point, and that's why China is trying to get that place under control, because this is part of their One Belt, One Road initiative. Now, there was a story that I missed. This is from almost a month ago now in the New York Times. American DNA expertise helps Beijing crack down. Now, listen. What they did was they used essentially Western technology, and what they did was, here's what the article says. The authorities called it a free health check. Tahir Amin had his doubts. They drew blood from the 38-year-old Muslim, scanned his face, recorded his voice, and took his fingerprints. They didn't bother to check his heart or kidneys, though, and they rebuffed his request to see the results. They said, you don't have the right to ask about this. If you want to ask more, you can go to the police. Mr. Amin was one of millions of people caught up in a vast Chinese campaign of surveillance and oppression. To give it teeth, the Chinese authorities are collecting DNA, and they got unlikely corporate and academic help from the United States to do it. China wants to make the country's Uyghurs, a predominantly Muslim ethnic group, more subservient to the Communist Party. It has detained up to 1 million people in what China calls re-education camps, drawing condemnation from human rights groups and a threat of sanctions from the Trump government. And do you think the Democratic candidates understand this? I didn't have time to do the graphic. I was very busy this week. There is a technological iron curtain being put in place. You need to know that it's coming. It will lead, I have no doubt, the persecution of Christians. That's prophesied in Scripture. I can't get around that. Christians are horribly persecuted. They're being killed and slaughtered in Nigeria, other places in Africa, in the Middle East. We need to kind of prepare our hearts for it. And I mentioned this last week, and I'm not using it because I was unprepared, but I just thought it was a good point. This is a mural at the Boston Public Library, and this is an article from the December 6, 1913, Sunday New York Times. And at the time it described this as the most popular mural in American art, by John Sargent, called The Prophets. Now the prophets are identified. This is the color version of that. And so if you go from left to right along the time, and most of these come from the period of time of the after the conquest into the kingdom. Now from in the center you have Moses. To his left you have Elijah, and to his right you have Joshua, the person putting his sword in the sheath. But starting on the left, going across the top, you have Amos, Nahum, Ezekiel, Daniel. Ezekiel and Daniel were prophets of the Babylonian exile. They were both carried away to Babylon. Daniel about 606 BC, Ezekiel in the second wave in 596 BC. Then you have, and Daniel's holding a thing that says, a scroll that says the wise will understand. That's from Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. And then you continued on down the right. You have, of course, Elijah, Moses, Joshua. Then you have Jeremiah, Jonah, who's holding a scroll or a piece of papyrus that says Jehovah, Yahweh, Isaiah, Habakkuk. In the lower panels on the left, you have Zephaniah, Joel, Obadiah, and then in the picture on the right, you have Hosea, Micah, Haggai, and the Italian prophet Malachi. Now, the interesting thing is to keep in mind, though, is we talk about flashpoints, and this week we're talking about converging flashpoints. So here, these prophets prophesied in the 800, 700, 600, 500, 400 BC, over 400 years before Christ. And they talked about this world in many respects, a restoration of Israel in the end times. And they talked about this restoration that was going to take place. The interesting thing is, and I cited this verse last week, Isaiah chapter 63, verse 18. That's the passage that talks about, who is this that comes from Edom with blood-stained robes, garments? It's Jesus returning at the time of his second coming. He's defeated enemies, I believe, scattered all along the valley there from Petra, Basra, all the way up to Megiddo, because they're coming against Jerusalem in the last days. It says in Revelation that the blood will flow as high as a horse's bridle for the space of 1,500. Don't quote me on the number. I don't have the passage open in front of me. 1,500 furlongs. It turns out to be around 180 miles. If you'd go from Megiddo, by the way, and you drive all the way down to Petra, you're going to drive about, how far? Just take a guess. 180 miles. I actually worked out on a map. But you understand that the prophets said, this is what's going to happen. And then 600 years after Jesus, a false religion arose called Islam that centers itself on trying to take over land, particularly Israel and Jerusalem. And they constantly make these things as, we want to wipe out Israel. We want to wipe out the Jews. We want to erase them from the map. And they'll say, well, we don't want to kill them. We just want to get rid of the country. Listen, Anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, they're all the same thing in my book. So this week, though, we had some things change. Donald Trump issued a tweet on Thursday. After 52 years, it's time for the United States to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is of critical strategic and importance to the state of Israel and regional stability. Benjamin Netanyahu responded, as you might think, to that tweet with this: at a time when Iran seeks to use Syria as a platform to destroy Israel, President Trump boldly recognizes Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Thank you, President Trump. Trump was interviewed this by Maria on Fox Business. Here's what Trump had to say in that interview.
On the Golan Heights, because you tweeted about this today in Israel. You said it is time for the U.S. to recognize Israel's sovereignty and the Golan Heights. Why now? Why did you send that out?
I've been thinking about doing it for a long time. It's been a very hard decision for every president. No president has done it. This is very much like Jerusalem, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. I did that. And I fully understand why Clinton and Bush and Obama, everybody campaigned on Jerusalem and the embassy going to Jerusalem. I even got the embassy built, by the way, very inexpensively. But they all campaigned on it. They never did it. And I understand why. Because when I got elected, I also campaigned on it. When I got elected, I was inundated with calls from all over the world. The leaders, mostly the leaders, saying, please don't do it, don't do it. I did it. And it's been done. And it's fine. Golan Heights is the same thing. For years, other presidents have campaigned. They said they'd do it. This is sovereignty. This is security. This is about regional security.
It's not about Netanyahu's reelection.
No, I don't. I wouldn't even know about that. I wouldn't even know about that. I have no idea. I hear he's doing okay. I don't know if he's doing great right now, but I hear he's doing okay. But I would imagine the other side, whoever's against him, is also in favor of what I just did. Every president has said, do that. I'm the one that gets it done.
Now, if he had tweeted that, it would be like 40 tweets, and he kind of speaks in Twitterese in the sense that he has these little bites about, oh yeah, by the way, I got it done more cheaply. That's a tweet, and so look, the reaction to this is all over the lot. People who have extremely negative views of President Trump say he's just doing this because he's going to really stick it to Israel when his great peace deal comes out in a couple weeks after the April 9th elections in Israel. I don't know. It's all kind of wild speculation. The other thing that happened, but this was a long-time U.S. policy not really to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. That's sort of true. Nobody really, I think a lot of presidents wanted to do it, but nobody had the guts to do this. So now what are they going to do with it? Are they going to make Israel give up something in return? Trump's hinted at that in the past. So this is I think an important thing that's happening. We don't know what this is like. The other thing that happened this week was Secretary of State Pompeo went to the Western Wall. Now, it's not unusual. When we were in Israel a couple of years ago, President Trump was there and he went to the Western Wall. But he went to the Western Wall. He did not have Prime Minister Netanyahu with him. When Vice President Pence went to the Western Wall, he did not have Prime Minister Netanyahu with him. But now, this time, this is unprecedented. And this is converging at this flashpoint we call the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And he went with Secretary of State Pompeo. They had a news conference at Prime Minister Netanyahu's official residence, and here is what Prime Minister Netanyahu had to say. There are some interesting comments here. I'll let it go. I won't have a lot to say in response.
I'm so excited. And we're so excited, Sarah and I, to have you here, but especially on this evening. This is the eve of Purim, and we have a miracle of Purim. We call it Nes Purim. President Trump has just made history. I called him. I thanked him on behalf of the people of Israel. He did it again. First, he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the U.S. embassy here. Then he pulled out of the disastrous Iran treaty and reimposed sanctions. But now he did something of equal historic importance. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And he did so at a time when Iran is trying to use Syria as a platform to attack and destroy Israel. And the message that President Trump has given the world is that America stands by Israel. We're celebrating Purim when 2,500 years ago, other Persians, led by Haman, tried to destroy the Jewish people. They failed then. And today, 2,500 years later, again, Persians led by Khomeini are trying to destroy the Jewish people and the Jewish state. They're going to fail again. We are deeply grateful for the U.S. support. We're deeply grateful for the unbelievable and unmatchable support for our security and our right to defend ourselves, and everything that you do on behalf of Israel and for the state of Israel in so many forms. So it is a distinct pleasure to welcome you and Susan to our home at any time, but especially today. And let me add another word about that. We had a moving visit today to the wall. I can't resist repeating this, but I'm going to. I said to the secretary that the last time Pompeo visited Jerusalem didn't end that well. But this is a different time. Rome and Jerusalem clashed over values with a great tragedy for the Jewish people. But the new Rome, the United States, views itself as a new Jerusalem. We visited the original city on the hill. We visited the hill. There is no greater friendship than the one between Israel and the United States. And no one represents it better than Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. You and Ambassador Friedman and your delegation are exceptional champions of our alliance. I've called you so many times on so many things that this evening I just want to say one word. Two, actually. Thank you.
I do have one comment. The reference to the United States as the new Rome. You know, look, we all have our opinions about how all this stuff is going to work out. And I'm probably less dogmatic now from a prophetic standpoint than I was before. I keep all of my charts in PowerPoint so I can erase them and edit them very easily. We have good ideas of things that are coming, some broad themes. We don't know the specifics yet. I do believe, listen, that mural with Daniel holding the verse, the wise will understand, that's a prophecy about the end times. It doesn't mean everyone will understand, okay? And as we get closer, look, I'm nearsighted. And if I don't wear my glasses, I can't see the sign. Even if you have great vision, you're driving down the freeway and you see the sign up ahead, you know it's a sign. It's unmistakably a sign. But what does it say? If you've never been there before, you don't know until you get closer, right? Then it comes into focus. And as you get closer and closer, well, in Ohio, you see that the sign really isn't all that great a shape because of the salt that gets thrown up there during the winter, but it becomes clearer. It's the same thing that will happen in Bible prophecy. As we get closer, things will become clearer. So look, I'm all for the arguments that go back and forth about the timing of this and all this, and listen, I'm fine with that. But it shouldn't get too nasty because you're not at the actual sign yet, and neither am I. So let's all be a little bit more humble when we talk about it. And look, you want to debate, you want to argue, my life is an argument. Not my home life, most of the time. But we need to talk about these things. Here's Pompeo's response.
As a cadet, I studied the battles of the Golan. There's a famous battle called the Battle of the Valley of Tears. And it was Israeli heroism at its most amazing, saving this great nation at a time of enormous challenge, a threat that came from east of the Golan, from Syria. A tank battle of epic and historic proportion of amazing Israeli bravery. Tonight, President Trump made the decision to recognize that hard-fought real estate, that important place, is proper to be a sovereign part of the state of Israel. President Trump made a bold decision to recognize that, an important decision for the people of Israel. It will truly be historic, and the people of Israel should know that the battles they fought, the lives that they lost on that very ground, were worthy and meaningful and important for all time.
And what he was talking about was the battle in the Yom Kippur War. Israel was attacked during Yom Kippur, because everybody would be at rest. It's a period of Sabbath rest, feast in Israel. And one of the great battles was in the Golan Heights, called the Battle of the Valley of Tears. A number of years ago, the BBC sort of did a different 3D graphic, and you can see how the Golan Heights sits above that body of water, which is the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River that comes into it. And there were Israeli kibbutzes down there in the lowlands, and they used to launch mortar shells down on the kibbutzes as they were farming and that sort of thing. And that just was intolerable. That was Syria. Listen, Syria is brutal. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. So they had this great battle. Syria almost broke through the line. They were represented in the red tanks. Israel was able to beat them back into the Valley of Tears and pretty much destroy. And it was an epic battle. The Syrian tanks probably had better armor at the time. Israel had better artillery and more accurate artillery. And one of the interviews I saw with one of the tank commanders said, I shot and shot and shot and shot. And so it's a very famous epic battle of all time. Pompeo and Trump were in this synagogue that's located under the Temple Mount. Not under the Temple Mount. It's in the Western Wall Tunnel, right? Okay. And maybe Jacob can talk later when he talks about what's on this the globe there. This is pictures of it when it was dedicated 2 or 3 years ago. There was a news program, Christian news program on, and they said this was under the Temple Mount, under the Dome of the Rock. That is baloney. The person who said that does not, I actually sent them an email. I said, you call yourself True News, you do not understand what you're talking about. It is in the Western Wall Tunnel. It is not under the Temple Mount. And then they accused Pompeo of saying that, well, I was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre when he was really under the Temple Mount with the Zionists showing people who's in control. This is anti-Zionism on an epic scale. He was listen, I watched the video. You can find the video of Secretary Pompeo. They put on his Twitter account, Sec Pompeo, @SecPompeo. And he was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I've been there. I'm like, that's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you don't know what the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, or you don't know what the Western Tunnels are, then don't talk about it. But something is driving the hatred there in that Christian program. Sputnik News said this: Pompeo's video shows Third Temple model sparks fears over biblical end times. That's a Russian news outlet. And here is this temple model there in that area. Here's Pompeo on CBN.
Today's being Purim, celebration. Jews worldwide, and here in Jerusalem we're talking about the fact that Esther, 2,500 years ago, saved the Jewish people with God's help from Haman. And now 2,500 years later, there's a new Haman here in the Middle East that wants to eradicate the Jewish people just like Haman did the state of Iran. Could it be that President Trump right now has been sort of raised for such a time as this, just like Queen Esther, to help save the Jewish people from an Iranian menace?
As a Christian, I certainly believe that's possible. It was remarkable. So we were down in the tunnels where we could see 3,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, if I have the history just right, to see the remarkable history of the faith in this place and the work that our administration has done to make sure that this democracy in the Middle East, of this Jewish state, remains. I'm confident that the Lord is at work here.
Syria came out and said they're going to take back the Golan Heights. Jerusalem Post reported that security forces are bracing for violence on the Golan border. The EU's response was predictable. They're not going to follow Trump in recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. Tulsi Gabbard, or whatever her name is, she's a Hawaiian congressman. I guess she's running for president. I think it'd be easier to listen to Democrats that aren't running for president right now. Another example of Trump and Netanyahu putting their own political interests ahead of interests of our respective countries will escalate tensions and likelihood of war between Israel, U.S., Syria, Iran, Russia, short-sighted. And she's very pro-Syrian, by the way. What do you people in Hawaii elect these people? Really? Are you banishing them from a beautiful place to torment us? World rejects Trump Golan promise. Here's an interview on Fox News, or just a panel. I'm just going to play probably it's about 2 minutes.
This is a landmark shift in U.S. policy towards Israel. The truth is that Israel has been controlling the Golan Heights for quite some time. I mean, when you look at, they've been attacked several times from there. When you look at the topography and the inherent military threat that Israel faces, not only from Iran, Hezbollah, ISIS, I mean, any enemy that would want to attack, they need to, of course, continue to control this land. The question is did the president and his team, did they need to officially recognize it in this way? I think most Democrats will probably argue that we should just keep the status quo, keep a UN presence there, and keep it as it is. I think the president and his team signaled today that it's important for the U.S. to officially recognize this, as Jared and Secretary Pompeo are working on a larger peace initiative. And I don't think any analyst who's paying attention to Syria for the past 6 years would want Assad or any of Israel's enemies to have control of this land or this territory.
I agree with much of that in the sense that this decision doesn't really change anything real on the ground, which of course is one indication that it wasn't all that necessary for Israel's security. I think there's a lot of politics behind this, both in terms of the president trying to help Bibi Netanyahu's reelection. Bibi Netanyahu is in a very close contest. Trump is very popular over there. And I think perhaps a little domestic U.S. politics trying to be a friend of Israel in this country. But, there is a downside to this, Brett, which is that Ronald Reagan in 1981 put the United States on record in favor of a Security Council resolution denying what was then Israel's attempt to impose Israeli law, a precursor to actual annexation. And it has been U.S. policy since that time to uphold that Security Council resolution. And it's an important principle that whether it was a defensive war or not, that borders should not change due to military action.
Now, back in, another response was, and by the way, back at the bottom in the New York Times article on the prior slide, it says, this is the New York Times headline. It used to be an Arab rallying point, and it's not anymore. Something's changing in the Arab world with its relation to Israel. This is kind of significant, too, with what's supposed to happen after the election. Here is against Erdogan. Of course, he came out and he spoke against this. This is a terrible thing that's happened. Erdogan has been very active in sort of erasing. This is some construction going on in a square honoring Ataturk in Istanbul. It's very symbolic, and he's making it over to honor, essentially turn it into, they're building a big mosque there. So he's changing Turkey from what was ostensibly a secular country into an Islamic country. This, I think, plays into Bible prophecy quite well. This battle at the Valley of Tears that I mentioned earlier, this is a graphic that was used in November of last year. Dore Gold and some others went and talked about the Golan at a hearing before, I think it was before the Senate committee. And if you go to jcpa.org, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, you can get the prepared remarks of Dore Gold. He did not have time to give them all when he testified in front of Congress. But he talks about the fact that before the Six-Day War in '67, the Syrians were lobbing shells down on farmers and other people that live 1,700 feet below. But the United States has always kind of recognized that this area is very important to Israel from a strategic standpoint. It is, if keeping the high ground is important, then I don't think I've ever been on a more important strategic piece of real estate than the Golan Heights in my life. And it's obvious when you're there. And you can kind of see the Mount Avital where you will go if you go on a tour of the Golan. It looks over Kenitra across the no man's land there, the supposedly UN-controlled area, although the UN's not worth much of anything anywhere. But you can see the Israeli engagement line and then the dotted line there where the Syrian side, and you see the Israel's controlling the high ground. And that's very important from strategically. In fact, to say that US presidents and stuff and other people have never recognized this is just a complete falsehood. Gerald Ford in 1975 wrote this letter to Yitzhak Rabin, and you can find this in Dore Gold's testimony. The U.S. has not developed a final position on borders. Should it do so, it will give great weight to Israel's position that any peace agreement be predicated on Israel's remaining on the Golan Heights. That was even affirmed by Secretary of State James Baker, who was no friend of Israel, the Secretary of State during the Reagan administration. And Secretary of State Warren Christopher also affirmed it during the Clinton administration. So this is a very important thing. Now, I want to just make a few comments. I'm probably going to go about another 15 minutes, and if we may start church just a little bit late. But this week there was a speech given by King Abdullah of Jordan. He claims to be a descendant of Muhammad, and there's a lot of questions about whether Muhammad was a real guy or anything. But he said, essentially, he declared Wednesday that Jerusalem was a red line for his kingdom amid rising tensions over a contested building at the city's Temple Mount. We've talked about this at the Gate of Mercy, that structure that's there. And they want to turn it into the fifth mosque on the Temple Mount. He said this: Jerusalem is a red line and we won't change our stance. It is our duty to protect. Listen to what he says and understand he is a Muslim, a descendant of Muhammad. It is our duty to protect the Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. Did he miss anybody when he said that? Yep. Do you think he was intentional when he said this? He was lying. He was erasing Israel and Judaism from the history of Jerusalem. He does it all the time. In fact, so he said, it is our duty to protect the Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. Don't believe what he says. When you go to Israel today, if you travel on Highway 60, you can see it up here near that big red dot. As you're driving out of Jerusalem, you will pass a hill, and on top of the hill is this structure. That structure is built at a place called, I hate it when I have somebody here who knows Hebrew, because I'll call it Gibeah. That building has stood there since before 1967, unfinished. That is the tribal area from where the first king of Israel, Saul, came from, where the tribe of Benjamin was. That building was to be King Abdullah's father's palace. The '67 war happened, and the building stopped being built, but it still stands there today. And I don't think a lot of people, I talked to somebody once who'd been to Israel a lot, and I was told, I didn't know what that was. I've seen it, but I just didn't know what it was. Now, why would King Hussein build a palace there? It's a very prominent point in the city of Jerusalem. It's one of the highest points. The view up there is tremendous. He did it to make a statement. Islam has conquered this land. You had a king, I built my palace on top of where he was from. I'm in charge. And that is the motivation behind what King Abdullah says. He is an Islamist, and he wants to show that he is in charge of the land. Now, it's interesting. There is a Syrian scholar. This is an interview that I found on, I think it was a Lebanese website. Brian, if you could zoom back out on that. Syrian scholar Firas al-Sawa. Al-Aqsa mentioned in the Quran. This is a Muslim scholar on TV saying, Al-Aqsa mentioned in the Quran is not in Jerusalem. We should critically examine our past and some of our religious traditions. He's a Muslim scholar, and he says that? You think King Abdullah believes that? Well, he might believe it, but he lies in front of you if he does. Report in the Jerusalem Post this there, the UN Rights Watch agency. 90% of Palestinian refugees in Syria need emergency assistance. And if you read the article, you will find that that number has barely changed since the start of the Syrian civil war, meaning that before the Syrian civil war, these people, Palestinian refugees in Arab Syria, lived in squalor. If you go to Jordan, and I've seen them myself, Palestinians are kept to this day in refugee camps in squalor under King Abdullah. There was a slaughter of Palestinians. It's called the Black September when they were trying to get Arafat out of Jordan. This is a picture in the Yarmouk refugee camp in Damascus, in the city limits of Damascus. One of the most densely populated people, and this was after the war, and they were giving out free bread one day. They keep their own people in prison in squalor, and then they complain about Israel. This report, look, there's a lot of speculation about this. Kushner's plan includes land swaps with the Saudis. There's a new book out called Kushner Inc. Everybody's got an opinion these days. Wait and see. I'm concerned with some of the things that he's doing. He's certainly sidling up to the Arabs, but that's not, Bush administration did the same thing. AIPAC is coming this year, and guess what? Hardly any of the Democratic presidential candidates are attending. Netanyahu will be there this week to speak. A pretty important American-Israel Political Action Committee big conference. Netanyahu right now is either arriving or on his way to Washington, D.C. He's meeting with Trump this week. They're capitulating to this guy who's the executive director of Move On. You cannot be progressive and support AIPAC because of the policies that they've supported. That's going to be the position of the Democratic Party. You'll get lip service. Oh, we were all in support of Israel and stuff. But look, this is what I think where it's going. This was also reported. Major AIPAC funder Adam Milstein pulls out of conference over anti-Muslim troops. Why? What were his anti-Muslim tweets? He told the truth. So look, we complain about New Zealand being Orwellian. It's going on here in America too, my friends. There was at some of the UN agencies, this is Hillel Noor, UN Human Rights Council voted 23-8 for Pakistan-sponsored resolution endorsing the absurd new report of inquiry into Gaza's peaceful protests. They also voted there in Switzerland that they did not support it. But I think the vote was only 26-16, that they didn't support President Trump's declaration about the Golan. The other thing that Pompeo did when he was there, and I think this is very important as well, and these newspapers from Athens, one in Greek, one in English, leaders agreed to, what they did was they got together, the leader of Greece, Cyprus, Secretary Pompeo, Prime Minister Netanyahu, to talk about the East Med pipeline. It is a way to get the oil and gas that's in the Leviathan field off of the coast of Israel to European markets. And this pipeline is being done. They say that it should come online in 2025. There have also been reports for many years that there is oil under the Golan. Maybe that's why there's a lot of fighting there. I've seen oil derricks up there on the Golan Heights. Some say it's more oil up there than in Saudi Arabia. I don't know. But I do think that this oil and gas that it represents will be part of the catalyst of an Ezekiel 38, 39, and maybe other wars in the end times. Syria this week, one of the things that they did was they were able to finally get rid of the last ISIS-controlled village. Now I'm going to take just a couple of minutes, and I need to check what time it is. Okay. There's some things going on with regard to Syria. Iranian oil flow to Syria has been cut off. They're running out of oil in Syria. Iranian sanctions are having their effect that Trump has put in place. Jonathan Spire was a great article the other day in the Wall Street Journal. He lives in Jerusalem. He's made aliyah from England. Iran-backed militias step up the battle in Iraq. Here's just some of the things that he said. He talks about how they're trying to take over Iraq. They're trying to take over Syria. This is Iran. These events, along with others, demonstrate that Iran's Shiite militia allies are beginning to constitute a second power in Iraq, within and beside the official state. Confrontation with the 5,200 U.S. troops in the country, in Iraq, is inevitable. If the Iranian strategy succeeds, Iraq's future might look like Lebanon, where the Shiite Hezbollah militia is an untouchable power inside the formal structures of the state and out. A Badr Corps officer told me at the movement's headquarters in Baghdad. In Iran, you have the Artesh, the army, and the IRGC. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is a state-organized Islamist militia. So it will be also in Iraq. There will be the army to defend the borders and the Shia militias to defend the regime. It would be a mistake to underestimate the militias. U.S. forces in Iraq should be ready for their next move. And so what happened this week was there's a progression of people to meet with Assad. The Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, met. The Iraqi military chief came, and then down below, people from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard came. And the reason is that Russia's trying to get out of Syria. And I think this is prophetic because, as I understand Ezekiel 38, it says that if it's Russia that's involved, it's I'll put hooks in your jaw and I'll draw you back. I think what I read in there is an implication that, well, they were there sort of on the northern borders of Israel and they decided to leave. And then they're drawn back in. And this oil and gas thing is going to be, I think, a flashpoint. Pompeo left Israel. He went to Lebanon and he spoke the truth there. He said Hezbollah has dark ambitions. This tweet that somebody, Observer IL, picked up talks about based on what an Iranian said. He translated it, he understands Farsi, and I looked at the original tweet, so this is accurate. And it's Iran talking about what they intend to do in Syria. Deployment of joint forces on the Syrian-Iraqi border and control of the Al-Qam and Alawite areas. Control of the port of Latakia. The establishment of a special force unit in the Golan Heights, where Hezbollah forms the nucleus of that force. Control of Damascus International Airport. This is what Iran wants to do. As they see Russia kind of backing away, they're not going to go home. They were in Syria this week with the Iraqi leaders and their Revolutionary Guard Corps leaders to meet with Assad to tell them what they're going to do. Another plan is holding shares of Syria's oil resources as part of their debt recovery. Building a Shiite suburb in Damascus like they've done with Beirut and Lebanon. Activate 18 bilateral cooperation agreements, most of which were frozen under Russian pressure. Clear trade and custom tariffs between Syria and Iran. Here's a picture of the port. of Latakia. At the same time, you have Israel cozying up to the Gulf monarchies. And we have the peace plan, whatever it is, that's supposed to be coming in a couple of weeks. So that is really all that I have time for. It is you see how all these flashpoints converging this week. So you see the prophets who prophesied about what was going to happen in the end times from 800 to 500 BC. They told us what would happen in the end times. And then 600 years after the birth of Christ, this religion arose in the Arabian Peninsula that now claims the right to these sites. And you see what they do. They deny the existence of Israel, that it ever had anything to do. Even though you can go back and find publications of theirs where they said the temple was built here by Solomon. But that's okay, we'll just lie and tell you something else. It's the way it goes. So, interesting times. Let's pray and then we'll get on with church. Father, thanks so much for your word. Pray that you'll bless us this day. Bless the word that it's brought to us and the teachings that will follow. Bless us this week. Lord, give us the impetus to live holy lives that are testimonies to others, to realize that our dependence is wholly on you for everything, that nothing that we do is worthy, but it's only because of the work that you did on the cross for us, and help us to share that gift of salvation, that message of salvation, the gospel with those around us. In Jesus' name, amen.